No watches, no calendars, no smartphones pinging reminders. Just sky, sand, and silence. Yet the Bedouins knew exactly when to plant, when to move, when to harvest, down to the week. They tracked time not in hours and minutes, but in the language of stars, animals, and seasons. A language older than cities, older than writing, and more precise than most of us could manage with a full set of apps. Oh, how did they do it? How do you measure time when time itself seems to disappear in the endless expanse of desert? The desert night is not like city darkness. There's no glow from streetlights, no distant hum of traffic, just infinite black, and thousands of stars so bright they seem close enough to touch. For the Bedouins, this wasn't just beautiful. It was functional. The night sky was their calendar, their compass, and their warning system all in one. Two stars mattered most, Canopus and Polaris. Polaris, the North Star, which they called Al-Jidi, was constant. Fixed. Always there. It pointed north every single night, all year long. When the sun set and darkness swallowed the dunes, a Bedouin could glance over his shoulder, position Polaris behind his right ear, then fix his gaze on a star to the south. That star became his bearing, a point of reference, a destination written in light. He'd walk for 5 minutes, eyes locked on that southern star, his feet reading the texture of sand beneath him while his vision stayed fixed above. Then he'd pause, turn, check Polaris again. The North Star hadn't moved, it never did. But that southern star? It had drifted westward, carried by Earth's rotation. So he'd recalibrate. Find a new southern star in the correct position. Lock onto it. Walk another 5 minutes. Repeat. This wasn't guesswork. This was precision navigation refined over thousands of years. The method worked because Polaris stayed put while every other star in the sky traced an arc across the heavens. It gave travelers a stable reference point in an environment where nothing else remained constant. Sand dunes shifted. Landmarks disappeared. Even familiar routes could become unrecognizable after a strong wind. But Polaris? Polaris endured. The ancient explorer Ahmed Hassanein Bey documented this technique in the 1920s while crossing the Sahara. He watched his Bedouin guide use this exact method night after night, marveling at how someone could maintain a perfectly straight course across hundreds of kilometers of featureless desert using nothing but stars. No maps, no instruments, just observation and memory. But Polaris was only half the story. It told you where you were going. It didn't tell you when to go. For that, you needed a different star. A star that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. A star whose very presence signaled transformation. Canopus, called Suhail in Arabic. When Suhail appeared on the eastern horizon just before sunrise in late August, everything changed. The scorching grip of summer began to loosen. Temperatures that had soared past 45 degrees started their gradual descent. The air shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Mornings carried a hint of coolness. Nights became bearable. For the Bedouins, this wasn't folklore. This wasn't superstition. This was observation refined through countless generations. Suhail's rising marked the end of one season and the beginning of another, a transition so reliable that entire tribes synchronized their lives to it. The star brought more than cooler weather. It brought wind, a chill southern breeze that arrived with such consistency that even the camels knew it. Bedouins in the Negev hills reported that camels who had been sleeping facing south would stand and turn north when Suhail appeared, positioning themselves away from the cold wind that star heralded. The animals felt it before humans did. They adjusted, and the Bedouins watched, verified, and learned to trust what the camels knew. But Suhail was just the first domino. Within 2 weeks of its appearance, another celestial marker followed, the Pleiades, known as Alpha. 7 stars clustered so tightly they appeared as a luminous smudge to the naked eye. When they rose at dusk on the western horizon in late October, every Bedouin farmer knew what it meant. The rains that Suhail had announced had now saturated the earth. The soil was ready. The waiting was over. It was time to plant winter grains. This timing wasn't arbitrary. 2 weeks of rain after Suhail's appearance gave the ground exactly the moisture it needed. Too early, and the seeds would die in dry soil. Too late, and the narrow window for growth would close. The Pleiades rising at dusk told farmers the moment had arrived. Precision without instruments. Certainty without meteorologists. The stars didn't just dictate planting schedules. They governed entire agricultural cycles. When the Pleiades rose at sunrise in mid-May on the eastern horizon, date palms began forming their green buds. The Bedouins knew this as surely as they knew their own names. They didn't need to inspect every tree. The stars told them. And when Sirius, called Alberbara, appeared on the horizon at dawn in early August, those dates were ripe, ready to harvest. The timing was so consistent that entire communities organized their labor around these celestial signals. Every phase of farming followed star patterns. Every journey referenced them. Every migration was timed to their movements. The stars rose 4 minutes earlier each evening, a shift imperceptible from night to night, but undeniable over weeks. This natural progression marked the passage of days more reliably than any sundial. Over the course of a year, the entire night sky rotated through its positions, creating a stellar calendar that repeated with mechanical precision. The Bedouins memorized not just individual stars, but entire star paths. Dozens of them. They knew which stars indicated frost was coming, which meant flash floods were likely, which signaled safe passage deeper into the desert. They understood that certain stars rising together spelled danger, storms at sea for coastal fishermen, or destructive winds for those inland. These weren't myths. These were documented weather patterns, observed and recorded over centuries, then encoded into the cultural memory through rhymes and sayings that made them easy to remember and pass down, that a Bedouin could look at the night sky and read it like we read a watch. That cluster low on the horizon? 2 weeks until the rains end. That bright star directly overhead. The coldest part of winter is here. That constellation just appearing at dusk? Time to harvest the dates and prepare for the dry season. They didn't need clocks. They had something better. They had a cosmic mechanism that never broke, never needed winding, never lost accuracy. All it required was a clear sky and the knowledge to read it. Knowledge that took a lifetime to master, but lasted forever once learned. Knowledge that made the difference between survival and death in a place where miscalculating by even a week could mean starvation. The stars weren't decoration. They weren't entertainment. They were infrastructure. They were the framework around which an entire civilization organized itself. And they worked. But the stars only worked at night. And they only worked when the sky was clear. What happened when clouds rolled in? What happened during the day, when even the brightest stars disappeared in the glare of the sun? That's when the Bedouins turned to a different kind of clock. One that walked on 4 legs. Camels, goats, sheep. These weren't just livestock. They weren't just transportation or food. They were living instruments. Biological sensors. Walking clocks. The Bedouins read their behavior the way modern people read dashboard gauges. Every change in posture, every shift in breathing, every alteration in movement patterns told them something about time, weather, or environmental conditions. Camels, in particular, were masters of time and temperature. These animals had evolved over millions of years to survive in the harshest environments on Earth. Their bodies contained mechanisms that humans simply didn't possess. Internal thermometers, moisture conservation systems, metabolic switches that could slow their bodies down when resources grew scarce. And the Bedouins learned to read every signal these magnificent creatures broadcast. That a camel's breathing pattern told experienced herders everything they needed to know about environmental conditions. Under normal circumstances, a camel breathed slowly and steadily. But when temperatures climbed toward dangerous thresholds, that breathing accelerated. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. A Bedouin watching his camel would notice the shift, the subtle increase in respiration rate, and know immediately that conditions had reached a critical point. Time to stop. Time to find shade. Time to wait out the heat. This wasn't instinct. This was knowledge refined through observation. Camels overheated more slowly than humans. Their bodies tolerated higher core temperatures. So when a camel started showing signs of heat stress, a human was already in danger. They just didn't know it yet. The camel provided advance warning, a biological early alert system that gave travelers hours to respond before their own bodies began to fail. The Bedouins treated this information as gospel. If the camel said stop, you stopped. No arguments. No calculations. No trying to push just a little further. The animal knew. And questioning that knowledge meant risking death. But camels did more than measure heat. They marked seasonal transitions. When Suhail rose on the horizon in late August, camels that had been resting while facing south would stand, turn, and reorient themselves to face north. They moved away from the chill southern wind that accompanied the star's appearance. Bedouins in the Negev hills documented this behavior year after year. It wasn't random. It wasn't occasional. It was consistent. The camels felt the atmospheric shift before humans did. Their thick coats, their desert-adapted senses, their finely tuned biological systems detected the change in air pressure and temperature that preceded the seasonal transition. And the Bedouins watched. They verified. They learned to trust what the camels knew. Goats played their own role in timekeeping. These hardy animals exhibited strong circadian rhythms, internal biological clocks that synchronized with the sun's position. Research on Bedouin goats in the Algerian Sahara revealed that their body temperatures, metabolic rates, and activity levels fluctuated throughout the day in predictable patterns. Early morning brought increased activity. The animals grazed more actively, moved more, vocalized more. As the day heated up, their behavior changed. They sought shade. They rested. They conserved energy. Then, as evening approached and temperatures dropped, activity resumed. A Bedouin herder didn't need to guess what time it was. He just watched his goats. If they were actively grazing, it was early morning or late afternoon. If they were huddled in the shade, barely moving, it was midday. The animals were walking sundials, their behavior mapping directly onto the passage of hours. Even more remarkably, goats showed seasonal variations in their metabolic parameters. Blood chemistry shifted with the seasons. Hormone levels rose and fell in sync with temperature and daylight patterns. These weren't random fluctuations. They were adaptations, biological mechanisms that helped the animals survive in extreme conditions. And observant Bedouins noticed these changes. A goat behaving differently in autumn than in spring wasn't sick. It was responding to seasonal cues. It was telling time on a larger scale, but animals weren't the only biological timekeepers. Plants played their part too. In early September, across the Negev hills and Sinai Desert, a white-flowered plant called Erginia marittima would sprout from the sand. The Bedouins called it the canopus reed, Ud is Suhail. When this plant appeared, every Bedouin in the region knew exactly what it meant. Suhail would rise in approximately 6 weeks. The plant was nature's advance notice. A botanical alarm clock set to the rhythms of the cosmos. This wasn't magic. This was ecology. The plant responded to subtle environmental cues, temperature shifts, moisture levels, changes in soil chemistry, that preceded the seasonal transition Suhail marked. It flowered at the same time every year because the conditions that triggered its growth occurred at the same time every year. The Bedouins simply observed the pattern, noted the timing, and used it as a predictive tool. Other plants served similar functions. Certain desert shrubs bloomed in response to specific weather patterns. Some indicated that rain was imminent. Others signaled that the frost season had passed. Experienced Bedouins knew dozens of these botanical markers. They could walk through seemingly barren landscape and read an entire seasonal calendar written in stems and leaves. The date palm, perhaps the most important plant in Bedouin agriculture, operated on its own stellar schedule. When the Pleiades rose at sunrise in mid-May, date trees began forming their green buds. This happened with such regularity that farmers didn't bother checking the trees individually. They watched the sky. When the Pleiades appeared in the right position, they knew every date palm in the region was beginning its reproductive cycle. By early August, when Sirius appeared on the eastern horizon at dawn, those dates were ripe. Harvest time. The Bedouins didn't need agricultural experts or botanical guides. The stars told them when to look. And when they looked, the fruit was always ready. This integration of celestial observation and biological monitoring created a timekeeping system of remarkable sophistication. When clouds obscured the stars, the animals provided backup. When nighttime fell, the stars took over from daytime biological markers. The system had redundancy built in. Multiple sources of temporal information, all cross-referencing each other, all pointing to the same conclusions. That a Bedouin didn't just track time. He existed inside a web of temporal signals, stellar, biological, botanical, that surrounded him constantly. His survival depended on reading these signals correctly. Missing a warning from the camels could mean heat stroke. Ignoring the flowering of the canopus reed could mean missing the optimal planting window. Failing to notice when the goats shifted from active to resting behavior could mean traveling during the deadliest part of the day. But those who paid attention, who learned the language of animals and plants and stars, gained something modern timekeeping could never provide. They gained connection, understanding, a deep, visceral awareness of the natural rhythms that governed their world. They didn't fight time. They moved with it. And that made all the difference. Time, for the Bedouins, wasn't linear. It didn't march forward in a straight line from past to future. It circled. It repeated. It flowed like water through sand, sometimes rushing, sometimes still, always finding its way back to where it started. And it was tied not to numbers on a calendar, but to something far more fundamental: rain, heat, and the endless search for pasture. The Islamic lunar calendar, the official calendar of their faith, was useless for this kind of timekeeping. Its months rotated through the seasons, appearing in summer one year and winter the next. Ramadan in December, then Ramadan in July, then back around again. Perfect for religious observation, disastrous for agriculture. You couldn't plant crops by a calendar whose months had no fixed relationship to seasons. You'd starved at so the Bedouins created their own system. Not written, not standardized, just observed, remembered, and passed down. A system rooted in the environment itself, in the actual conditions that determined whether you lived or died. The year divided into two great movements: the rainy winter and the dry summer. These weren't arbitrary divisions. They weren't cultural preferences. They were ecological realities that dictated every aspect of Bedouin life. During the rainy season, roughly December through March, the impossible happened. The desert bloomed. Rain brought life to sand. Not everywhere. Not abundantly, but enough. Grass sprouted between dunes. Sedge pushed through parched earth. Shrubs that looked dead for 9 months suddenly produced green leaves. Water collected in shallow depressions, creating temporary pools that could sustain herds for weeks. For a brief, precious window, the deep desert could support life that so the Bedouins moved inward, away from settled areas, away from cultivated land, deep into regions that would be fatal the rest of the year. They packed their goat hair tents, loaded their possessions onto camels, and migrated into the heart of the wilderness. Not because they wanted adventure, because that's where the food was. The animals needed to graze. And during winter, the best grazing existed in places that turned lethal by April. This wasn't wandering. This was choreography. Every tribe knew their routes, their territories, their stopping points. Families would spread out during the rainy months, moving in smaller household units. 3 tents instead of 15. This maximized the use of scattered pasture. Too many animals in one place would exhaust the vegetation too quickly, so they dispersed, each household finding its own patch of green, its own temporary water source, its own small corner of survivable desert. They'd stay in one location as long as the grazing lasted. When the animals had consumed the available plants, it was time to move. Pack up, migrate to the next spot. Sometimes this meant traveling just a few kilometers. Sometimes it meant days of movement. The distance didn't matter. What mattered was keeping the herds fed. No food for the animals meant no milk. No milk meant death. But by late spring, the pattern reversed. The rain stopped. The temporary pools evaporated. The grass withered. The shrubs retreated back into dormancy. And the deep desert became what it was most of the year, uninhabitable. So the Bedouins moved back out. Toward the edges, toward permanent water sources, toward the margins of cultivated land where wells existed and some vegetation survived year-round. Summer pastures were found in the north, in cooler steppe regions, in mountain highlands. These areas stayed buried under snow during winter, too cold, too inaccessible for livestock. But when summer arrived, the snow melted. The highland meadows turned lush. Temperatures that were scorching at lower elevations were bearable at altitude. So the tribes moved up, into the mountains, into the tablelands, away from the furnace of the lowland desert. Some groups practiced transhumance, a more structured form of seasonal migration. They'd plant crops near permanent homes in the valleys at the onset of the rains. Then they'd move their livestock to highland pastures for the summer. When autumn arrived, they'd return to the valleys to harvest what they'd planted months earlier. The land itself became a storage system. You deposited seeds in one season and withdrew food in another. Other groups took a different approach. They planted grain along their migration routes. In areas where winter rainfall was predictable, they'd scatter seeds in autumn, then move on. Months later, when they returned to their winter camping grounds, the grain would be ready. Harvest coincided with arrival. The timing worked because the migration patterns and the growing seasons were synchronized. The Bedouins had spent centuries figuring out exactly where to plant, when to plant, and when to return. It was agriculture stripped to its essence. No permanent fields, no irrigation, no storage facilities, just seeds, rain, and precise timing. The seasonal movements weren't just about food for animals. They were about temperature regulation. Summer in the lowland desert could kill you. Temperatures soared past 50 degrees. Sand became hot enough to burn through shoe leather. The air itself felt like breathing fire. But moved to higher elevation, even just a few hundred meters, and conditions became survivable. The Bedouins of Wadi Fainan and Jordan moved up to the highlands when summer arrived, seeking cooler temperatures and better grazing. Then, when winter brought cold to the mountains, they moved back down into the valleys where the wadi floor provided shelter and relatively warmer conditions. This constant movement created a temporal rhythm that structured everything. Spring meant dispersal. Families splitting apart, heading in different directions, each following their animals to wherever food could be found. Summer meant mountain pastures and highland camps. Autumn meant convergence. Families coming back together, meeting up with near kin, forming larger camps of 10 or 15 tents. Winter meant deep desert grazing during the rains, followed by return to settled areas when the water ran out. You didn't need a calendar to know what season you were in. You just looked around. Cold morning air? Autumn approaching. Smell of moisture before dawn. Rain coming. Green shoots between dunes. Winter. Withered shrubs and scorching heat. Summer. The environment itself was a calendar, each season marked by unmistakable signs that anyone who'd grown up in the desert could read instantly. But this system only worked because the Bedouins possessed something modern people have largely lost: multi-generational knowledge. A young Bedouin didn't learn migration routes from a map. He learned them by traveling with his father, who had traveled with his father, who had traveled with his father. Each generation passed down the knowledge of where water could be found, which routes were safest, when to move, and when to wait. They memorized landmarks invisible to outsiders. A particular rock formation, a grove of acacia trees, a curve in a wadi that marked where floodwater collected. These waypoints existed in memory, not on paper. And they were essential. In featureless desert, where one dune looked identical to the next, these mental maps meant the difference between reaching water and dying of thirst. They also learned to read subtle indicators of time passing. The angle of shadows at midday, the rate at which morning dew evaporated, the texture of sand underfoot, the weight of the air. These weren't mystical abilities. They were pattern recognition honed through constant exposure. When you spent your entire life moving through the same environments at the same times of year, you started to notice things. Tiny details, micro patterns, and those details aggregated into a sophisticated understanding of time's passage. A Bedouin didn't think, "It's October 15th. He thought, "The dates are ripe. Suhail rose 2 weeks ago. The morning air has that certain coolness, and the goats are behaving the way they do when autumn arrives." All of these observations pointed to the same moment in the annual cycle. Together, they provided more information than any calendar date could offer. The seasonal movements weren't scheduled. They were negotiated. With the environment, with the weather, with the needs of the animals. A particularly good rainy season might mean staying in the deep desert longer. A drought might force an early return to permanent water sources. Flexibility was essential. Rigid schedules would get you killed. But flexibility required constant attention to environmental signals. You had to read the land, the sky, the animals, and your own body. All the time, without break. This created a relationship with time that modern people rarely experience. The Bedouins didn't watch time pass. They moved through it. They existed inside it. Time wasn't something external that you measured with a device. It was woven into everything you did, every decision you made, every mile you traveled. And it worked. For thousands of years, it worked. But what happened when all external markers failed? When clouds obscured the stars for days? When the animals were asleep or out of sight? When the landscape offered no clues because you were crossing terrain you'd never seen before? When even the seasonal patterns provided no guidance because you were in the middle of a season, not at its beginning or end. That's when the Bedouins turned inward, to the one instrument they always carried, the one clock that never stopped running, their own bodies. Over generations of desert life, Bedouins developed an internal sense of time that bordered on supernatural. They could wake minutes before sunrise without any external alarm. They could estimate how many hours of daylight remained without seeing the sun. They could judge the passage of time during the darkest part of night when no stars were visible. This wasn't magic. This wasn't genetic gift. This was adaptation. The human body is capable of remarkable things when survival depends on it. Sleep patterns played a crucial role. Bedouins didn't sleep the way modern people do, one long, uninterrupted block of unconsciousness. They slept in segments, short cycles of rest separated by periods of wakefulness. They'd lie down after sunset, sleep for a few hours, wake naturally, check the camp, adjust the fire, observe the stars, then sleep again. This pattern repeated through the night. This wasn't insomnia. This was adaptation. In the desert, deep sleep meant vulnerability. You couldn't hear predators approaching. You couldn't feel temperature changes. You couldn't sense when wind shifted or when a storm was building. So Bedouins learned to sleep lightly, to remain partially aware even while resting, to wake at the slightest stimulus, a sound, a temperature change, an unfamiliar smell. This created an intimate relationship with the night's progression. Waking multiple times meant multiple reference points. The position of stars when you first lay down, their position when you woke the first time, their position when you woke again. Each observation provided information about how much time had passed. After years of this pattern, estimation became automatic. Unconscious. You didn't think about it. You just knew. The body itself provided temporal markers. Temperature was the most obvious. Human core temperature follows a circadian rhythm, reaching its lowest point in the early morning hours before dawn. Bedouins learned to recognize this. The particular quality of pre-dawn cold. The way it felt different from midnight cold or evening cold. Not just colder, different. That specific chill signaled that sunrise was close. Time to prepare for the day. Hunger operated on its own schedule. The Bedouins ate their main meal in the evening, after sunset, when the heat had passed. They'd have small amounts during the day, some dates, a bit of milk, maybe some flatbread, but nothing substantial. Heavy food during heat was dangerous. It raised core temperature. It pulled blood to the digestive system. It triggered sweating. So they waited until evening. This created a natural rhythm. Morning brought mild hunger. Midday brought stronger hunger, suppressed by the need to remain still during peak heat. Late afternoon brought intense hunger, signaling that the dangerous part of the day was ending. Evening brought the satisfaction of a full meal. This cycle repeated daily, creating a biological clock that aligned with the sun's position. Thirst became an even more precise timer. Water was rationed carefully. Every member of a traveling party knew their allocation. Small sips taken at specific intervals. The Bedouins learned exactly how long they could go between drinks based on temperature, exertion level, and the time of day. This wasn't guesswork. This was calibrated through experience. You learned your body's limits the hard way, through close calls, near misses, moments when you pushed too far and suffered the consequences. An experienced Bedouin could estimate time remaining until the next water source based on how thirsty he was. 3 sips left in the water skin? That meant roughly 2 hours of travel at current pace. 1 sip? Time to slow down, find shade, and wait for cooler evening temperatures. Empty skin and mild thirst. 30 minutes until serious trouble began. Empty skin and serious thirst? Crisis. During the hottest part of the day, when the sun reached its peak and movement meant death, the Bedouins employed a technique that looked like simple rest, but was actually sophisticated biological manipulation. They'd find the deepest shade available, inside their tents, beneath a rock overhang, under heavy blankets draped to create a microclimate. Then they'd lie down, close their eyes, and enter a state somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. Their breathing slowed, deep, controlled, deliberate. Their heart rates dropped. Metabolism decreased. Every system in their bodies shifted into low-power mode. This wasn't meditation. This wasn't relaxation technique. This was survival physiology. By minimizing bodily functions, they minimized heat production. By staying absolutely still, They avoided triggering the sweating response. By breathing slowly through the nose, they reduced moisture loss. In this state, time became elastic. An hour could feel like 10 minutes or like 3 hours. But it didn't matter. The goal wasn't to track time passing. The goal was to survive until the sun's angle changed and movement became safe again. When the particular quality of heat shifted, when the pressure of it eased just slightly, experienced Bedouins would feel the change even with their eyes closed. Time to move again. They could also gauge time by shadow movement without looking at the sun. The angle of shadows changed throughout the day in predictable patterns. Morning shadows stretched long toward the west. Midday shadows shrank to almost nothing. Afternoon shadows lengthened toward the east. A Bedouin walking across open desert could glance at the shadow his own body cast and know immediately what part of the day he was in. Early morning, shadow extends 3 body lengths to the west. Late afternoon, 2 body lengths to the east. High noon, barely a shadow at all. Sand temperature provided another clock. Morning sand was cool enough to walk barefoot. By mid-morning it became uncomfortable. By noon it could burn skin in seconds. Late afternoon brought gradual cooling. Evening made it bearable again. Night made it cold. This cycle was so consistent that experienced Bedouins could estimate the time by pressing their hand to the ground. The heat radiating up through their palm told them everything they needed to know. Even the quality of light changed in recognizable patterns. Not just brightness, quality. The harsh white glare of midday looked and felt different from the softer yellow of mid-morning. The golden light of late afternoon had its own character. The blue twilight before full darkness was unmistakable. These shifts happened gradually, imperceptibly, but cumulatively they marked the day's progression as clearly as any sundial. Air density changed with temperature. Hot air felt heavy, thick, almost solid. Cool morning air felt thin, light, easy to breathe. The transition between these states mapped directly onto time of day. Bedouins learned to sense these differences without conscious thought. The weight of the air on their skin told them whether they were in the dangerous part of the day or the safe part. Wind patterns followed daily schedules. Morning breezes came from one direction. Midday heat created thermal updrafts. Evening brought cooling winds from another direction. Night wind differed from day wind in temperature, consistency, and behavior. A Bedouin standing still, feeling the air move across his skin, could estimate the time without seeing anything. All of these signals combined to create an internal clock of remarkable precision. The Bedouins didn't consciously analyze each indicator. They didn't think, the sand is this hot, the shadow is this long, the air feels this heavy, therefore it must be 3 hours past noon. That kind of deliberate calculation was too slow, too unreliable. Instead, the knowledge became intuitive, embedded, automatic. Your body told you what time it was the same way it told you when you were hungry or tired. The information just arrived. You knew without knowing how you knew. This didn't happen overnight. It took years, decades, a lifetime of constant exposure to the same environmental patterns. Children grew up watching their parents respond to subtle temporal cues. They absorbed the knowledge through observation long before they understood what they were learning. By the time they were adults leading their own families through the desert, the clock was already running inside them. And it worked. Bedouins could coordinate complex activities without any timekeeping devices. Meeting other travelers at a specific location. Arriving at a well when other tribes weren't using it. Reaching seasonal pastures at the exact moment when the grazing was optimal. All of this required temporal precision. And they achieved it using nothing but observation, experience, and the biological instruments they carried inside their own bodies. The Bedouins didn't conquer time. They didn't need to. They learned its language. They felt its rhythms. They moved with it instead of against it. And in doing so, they survived, thrived, in a place where one miscalculation could mean death. No clocks, no calendars, no devices, just awareness, connection, and a deep, visceral understanding of how time flows when you stop trying to trap it in numbers and start experiencing it as what it really is, the pulse of the world itself.